I started with $1.20 per week, built a fortune worth hundreds of millions. The distance between those two numbers is shorter than you think. If you're staring at your bank account wondering how you'll ever build real wealth, if that first $1,000 seems impossible, if you feel trapped earning just enough to survive but never enough to invest, I understand. I made $1.20 per week at 13 years old. I know exactly what it means to have nothing. I know what it feels like to work 72 hours for wages that barely keep your family fed. I know the mathematics of poverty. But here's what I also know. By 28, my annual income was $42,000, and most of it didn't come from my job. It came from investments I'd made with money I barely had. By 33, I was wealthy beyond my childhood imagination. By 65, I sold my steel company for $480 million. But none of that matters to you if you don't understand how the first 1,000 works, because that first 1,000 taught me everything. It revealed principles that turned poverty into wealth, principles that have nothing to do with luck and everything to do with recognizing what money actually is and what it can do if you understand the mathematics of multiplication. Let me show you how the first $1,000 actually happens. Not the fantasy version where you save pennies from your paycheck for 20 years. The real version. The version that changed my life and built one of the largest fortunes in American history. The first thing you need to understand is why wages alone will never build wealth. This isn't pessimism, it's mathematics, and I learned it the hardest way possible. In 1848, when I was 13 years old, my family immigrated to America from Scotland. We were escaping starvation and my father's failed weaving business. We arrived in Pittsburgh with nothing. We lived in 2 rooms above my aunt's weaving shop, and I went to work immediately because we needed every penny just to survive. My first job was as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill. Do you know what a bobbin boy does? You run between the looms, changing spools of thread. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, 72 hours of labor for $1.20. Let me give you that mathematics. $1.2 divided by 72 hours equals 1.6 cents per hour. That was my value in the market. That was what my time was worth when I had nothing but my time to sell. Here's what I figured out within the first month. Even if I saved every single penny, which I couldn't because we needed to eat, it would take me years to accumulate even $100. And that's assuming nothing went wrong. No illness, no emergency, no unexpected expense. The mathematics of poverty are brutal and precise. At $1.20 per week, you're not building wealth, you're barely surviving, and the moment you stop working, the money stops coming. My father understood this. He quit the cotton mill after a few months because he found the work degrading and depressing. He went back to his handloom, trying to peddle his own cloth, but there were no buyers. Mother took in shoe-binding work at night. Between the 3 of us, we scraped by. Barely. Do you know what 72 hours of your life is worth in dollars? Have you done that calculation? Because until you do, you won't understand why the wage game is a trap. Even when I got promoted, even when I moved to the telegraph company making $2.50 per week, nearly double my bobbin boy wages, I was still in the same trap. More money, yes. Better conditions, absolutely. But still the same fundamental equation. My time traded for their money, my hours bounded by the day, my income capped by my energy and my mortality. The telegraph job taught me something crucial, though. I learned to read telegraph signals by ear, without writing them down first. This wasn't required. Most operators used the paper transcription method, but I taught myself to hear the patterns, to translate the clicks and pulses directly into letters and words. Within a year, I was faster than operators who'd been working for a decade. That skill caught the attention of Thomas Scott, the superintendent of the Western Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and at 18 years old he hired me as his personal telegraph operator at $4 per week, which soon became $35 per month. This was transformative income. $35 per month was more than my father had made in his best years as a weaver. This was middle-class money. This was security. But here's what I noticed. Even at $35 per month, even as I climbed through the railroad ranks, even when I became superintendent at 24, making $1,500 per year, a salary that placed me firmly in the American middle class, I could still see the ceiling. I was still trading time for money, still bounded by the hours in a day, still limited by my physical capacity to work. The trap had gotten more comfortable, but it was still a trap. Here's the real question. Are you building skills that scale, or just trading time for slightly more money? Because there's a crucial distinction that most people never see. My telegraph skill scaled. The better I got, the more valuable I became, and that opened doors to better positions. But even scaled skills have limits if you're still selling time. There's only one of you. There are only 24 hours in a day. You can optimize and improve and become the best in the world at what you do, but if you're still trading hours for dollars, you've just built a nicer cage. I saw this clearly at 24. I was making $1,500 per year as a railroad superintendent. This was more money than I'd ever imagined as a 13-year-old bobbin boy. This was success by every measure I'd been taught to value. And yet I could calculate exactly how much I'd make in a year, in 10 years, in my lifetime. The ceiling was high, but it was still a ceiling. The numbers were better, but the game was the same. Addition, not multiplication. Linear income, not compound growth. What would happen if you doubled your income tomorrow? Would your life fundamentally change, or would you just have a bigger number in the same trap? Because that's the question that haunted me. I could see men who'd been railroad executives for decades, comfortable, secure, trapped, making good money but never building real wealth, never crossing the threshold into multiplication. And I knew I had to find a different game. Let me show you the moment everything changed. The moment I discovered what multiplication actually looks like. This is the part of the story that reveals how the first 1,000 really works, and it starts with a decision that terrified me. In 1855, I was 20 years old, working as Thomas Scott's assistant on the railroad. I'd been promoted several times. I was making decent money. I had maybe $50 saved. Maybe. Probably less. And Thomas Scott came to me with an opportunity. He asked me if I had $500. $500. I had $50. The gap between what I had and what he was asking for was enormous, absurd, impossible. He told me there were 10 shares of Adams Express Company available, a freight and messenger company that contracted with the Pennsylvania Railroad. He said if I could come up with $500, he'd help me buy those shares. This was my mentor, my boss, the man who'd taught me everything about the railroad business, telling me he wanted to make me a partner in his investment strategy. I said I thought I could manage that sum. I lied. I had no idea how I'd manage it, but I knew this was the threshold. This was the moment where I either stayed in the wage game forever or crossed over into the multiplication game. So I told him yes, and then I went home and told my mother what I'd done. Here's what you need to understand about that moment. We owned a home worth $700. That was our only asset, the only thing standing between us and the poverty we'd fled from Scotland. And I was asking my mother to mortgage $600 of that $700 home so I could buy shares in a company I didn't fully understand on the recommendation of my boss. in a transaction that could easily fail and leave us homeless. The weight of that decision was crushing. This wasn't play money. This wasn't extra capital. This was everything. My mother took the steamer to East Liverpool the next morning. She traveled to my uncle's town, a justice of the peace who had access to farmers' money held for investment. She told him we needed $500. She mortgaged our home. She came back with the money and handed it to me. $500 that represented almost everything we had. I gave it to Thomas Scott. He bought the 10 shares. And then we waited. 1 month passed. 2 months. Every day I wondered if I'd just destroyed my family's security, if I'd gambled our home on insider information and a promise, if I was about to learn the most expensive lesson of my life. Then, one morning, a white envelope appeared on my desk at the railroad office. I opened it. Inside was a check for $10. $10 I hadn't worked for. $10 that appeared because I owned a fraction of a company. $10 that represented revenue from capital, not from my labor. The check was from the Gold Exchange Bank of New York, signed by the cashier. I stared at that check for a long time. I said out loud, "Eureka! Here's the goose that lays the golden eggs." That's when I understood. That's when everything changed. That $10 check revealed the machinery of wealth. Adams Express paid monthly dividends in those days, which meant every month I'd receive another check. $10 per month, $120 per year, just for owning the shares. No additional labor required, no more hours worked. The money appeared because the company made profits and distributed them to shareholders. My $500 was working for me now. It was out there in the economy, embedded in a business, generating returns while I slept. Do you understand the difference? For 5 years, I'd been trading my time for wages. Every dollar I earned required my presence, my energy, my hours. But this $10 dividend required nothing from me except ownership. I owned a tiny piece of a profitable business, and that business sent me money every month. This was multiplication. This was the compound effect. This was how wealth actually builds. My friends at the railroad couldn't believe it. How could money make money without work? None of us had ever seen this. We were all wage earners. We all traded time for dollars. But now I was receiving capital income, passive income, money that flowed from ownership rather than labor. They started calling me a capitalist, half joking, half serious. But I wasn't joking. I'd crossed a threshold and I knew I could never go back. Have you ever received money you didn't trade your time for? Have you ever felt that shift? Because it changes everything. It changes how you think about money, how you think about work, how you think about what's possible. Before that dividend check, I thought wealth meant earning a high salary. After that dividend check, I understood wealth meant owning assets that generate income. The wages pay for survival. The assets build the fortune. Here's what I did next. Less than a year later, Thomas Scott showed me another opportunity. T. Woodruff had invented a sleeping car for trains, a revolutionary idea for long-distance rail travel. Scott suggested I invest. The problem was the same as before. I didn't have the capital. I'd been receiving my $10 monthly dividends, but I'd been reinvesting them into other opportunities and supporting my family. I still didn't have significant savings, so I borrowed again. I went to a local bank and took out a loan for $217.50. Borrowed money, debt, risk compounded on top of risk. I invested that borrowed money in Woodruff's sleeping car company, then I waited again. This time, the returns came faster. Within 2 years, I was receiving $5,000 annually from that investment. $5,000 per year. more than 3 times my salary as a railroad superintendent, more than I could earn through labor alone. And this was just from $217.50 that I'd borrowed. Do you see the pattern now? I didn't save my way to wealth. I borrowed my way to ownership, then reinvested the returns into more ownership. Every dividend, every return, every profit went back into new investments. I invested in oil wells in Pennsylvania. I invested in iron companies. I invested in bridge building companies. Every opportunity Thomas Scott showed me, every business connected to the railroad boom, I found a way to buy a piece of it, sometimes with my own money, often with borrowed money, always with the understanding that ownership multiplies while wages merely add. By 1863, when I was 28 years old, my annual income was $42,000. $2,400 of that came from my railroad salary. The rest, over $39,000, came from investments, from ownership, from assets that generated income while I did other things. That's how the first 1,000 actually works. That's how you cross from poverty to wealth. Not by saving wages, not by living on rice and beans for decades. By finding the threshold where your money starts working harder than you do, then pushing every dollar across that threshold as fast as possible. Here's what I'm asking you to understand. Do you see the difference between addition and multiplication yet? Because your first 1,000 depends on it. Addition is wages. You work an hour, you get paid for an hour. You work harder, you get paid slightly more. But you're always bounded by time. Multiplication is ownership. You buy an asset once, it generates returns indefinitely. You improve the asset, the returns multiply. You reinvest the returns, the multiplication compounds. The first dividend check was $10, but the principal it revealed was worth millions. That principle was this: capital deployed into productive assets generates returns that exceed the capital itself. A $500 investment generating $120 per year is a 24% annual return. That same $500, if left in my pocket, generates zero. The difference between 0 and 24%, repeated over years, is the difference between poverty and wealth. It's that simple, it's that brutal, it's that clear. Are you still playing the wages game? Not just your salary, I mean mentally. Are you still thinking in terms of hours traded for dollars? Because until you break that frame, the first 1,000 will stay out of reach. Until you understand that wealth comes from ownership, not earnings, you'll stay trapped in addition when you need multiplication. The breakthrough isn't working harder or earning more. The breakthrough is crossing the threshold into asset ownership and never looking back. Now let me show you the 3 specific behaviors that compound, the 3 patterns that took my first 1,000 and turned it into hundreds of millions. These aren't secrets. These are just patterns that most people refuse to follow because they require something uncomfortable. They require delayed gratification at a level that feels almost inhuman. But this is how compound growth actually works. The first behavior is aggressive reinvestment. Every dividend I received went back into new investments. Every return, every profit, every dollar that came from my assets went immediately into buying more assets. At 21 years old, I was receiving $5,000 annually from my sleeping car investment. That was more than enough to live well. I could have rented a nice apartment, bought fine clothes, enjoyed the rewards of my risk-taking. But I didn't. Mother and I stayed in our modest home. We lived simply. We consumed almost nothing. Every dollar I didn't absolutely need for survival went back to work. This is the pattern that most people break. They make their first successful investment. They see returns, and they immediately start consuming those returns. They upgrade their lifestyle. They signal their success. They treat the dividends like bonus salary to be spent. But that's the trap. Every dollar you consume is a dollar that can't compound. Every luxury you buy is a future fortune you're trading away. The critical window is the first 10 years of ownership. That's when the compounding has its maximum effect. That's when the difference between reinvesting and consuming determines whether you build serious wealth or just have a comfortable income. I watched men around me make this mistake over and over. They'd get access to good investments through the railroad connections. They'd see returns. And within a year, they'd upgraded their entire lives. Better homes, better clothes, better everything. Meanwhile, their capital stayed static because they were consuming the growth. I did the opposite. I lived below my means and pushed every available dollar into productive assets. That's why by 28 my investment income exceeded $40,000. That's why by 33 I was wealthy. Because I compounded aggressively during the window when compounding matters most. Are you consuming your progress or compounding it? Be honest with yourself, because this is where most people fail. Not in the earning, not in the initial investment, in the discipline to let the returns compound instead of spending them. The first 1,000 teaches you this lesson. You can either consume it or multiply it. You can't do both. The second behavior is learning faster than you earn. Thomas Scott didn't just give me investment opportunities, he taught me how to think about business, how to read a company, how to understand economics and politics and market dynamics. Every conversation with him was an education. Every railroad executive I met became a potential teacher. I asked questions constantly. I read everything I could access. Colonel Anderson had opened his personal library to working boys when I was young, and I'd spent every Saturday night there reading about business, about money, about America. That foundation of self-education compounded throughout my career. Here's why learning compounds. Each new skill unlocks new opportunities. Learning telegraphy by ear got me promoted to the railroad. Understanding railroad economics let me see which industries would benefit from the railroad boom. Studying iron and steel manufacturing let me recognize that steel would replace iron in every application. Every piece of knowledge I acquired gave me an advantage in recognizing the next opportunity. The men who stayed at the same level their entire careers weren't stupid, they were static. They stopped learning. They mastered their current job and then coasted. Meanwhile, the world kept changing, and they had no framework for recognizing what was changing or why it mattered. What are you learning right now that will unlock opportunities 5 years from now? Not just job skills, not just promotions within your current field. Strategic knowledge, market dynamics, technology trends, economic patterns, the kind of learning that lets you see opportunities before they're obvious. That's what compounds. That's what turns the first 1,000 into the first 100,000. Because knowledge multiplies your ability to deploy capital effectively. Two people with the same $1,000 will get completely different results based on what they know about where to invest it. The third behavior is following the infrastructure. In the 1850s and 60s, America was building a railroad network. Every mile of track needed bridges, telegraph lines, sleeping cars, and eventually steel rails. I didn't chase speculative investments. I didn't try to predict which individual companies would win. I invested in the infrastructure itself, the picks and shovels of the railroad boom, the foundational components that every railroad company needed regardless of which companies succeeded or failed. This is pattern recognition. What infrastructure is being built right now in your economy that's non-optional? What foundational components will every future business need? That's where you position yourself. That's where you deploy capital. Not in the speculative stuff, not in the fads, in the boring, essential, foundational infrastructure that everything else is built on top of. Railroads were that infrastructure in my era. What's the equivalent in yours? I stood on rail lines watching construction crews lay track across Pennsylvania. Steel rails, iron bridges, telegraph wires running parallel to the tracks. The entire nervous system and skeletal structure of American commerce being built in real time. And I understood something crucial. Every business in America would eventually depend on this network. Every manufacturer, every wholesaler, every merchant. Anyone who needed to move goods or communicate over distance would have no choice but to use the railroads. That meant whoever owned pieces of this infrastructure owned pieces of every business that touched it. So that's where I put my money, into the railroad-adjacent industries, into the components that made railroads possible, into the services that made railroads useful. Bridge companies, telegraph companies, sleeping car companies, later, steel companies, always following the infrastructure, always investing in the foundation rather than the flashy surface-level opportunities. These three behaviors compound. Aggressive reinvestment multiplies your capital. Relentless learning multiplies your ability to deploy that capital effectively. Following infrastructure multiplies your probability of success. Together, they create a flywheel effect where each successful investment funds the next one. Each piece of knowledge reveals the next opportunity. Each infrastructure position strengthens your market understanding. That's how $500 became $40,000 per year in 13 years. That's how the first 1,000 becomes the first million. Let me bring this back to you. At 13, I worked 12 hours a day for $1.20 per week. I thought I'd be trapped there forever. The mathematics of poverty are designed to keep you trapped. The wage game is designed to keep you trading time for survival with nothing left over for multiplication. But I saved my first dollar anyway, then $10, then $100, then I borrowed $500 with our home as collateral and bought my first shares. That first 1,000 taught me everything. It taught me that linear income has a ceiling built into the nature of time itself. That wages trap you in addition when you need multiplication. That the only way to break free is to cross the threshold where your money works harder than you do. The first 1,000 isn't about the amount, it's about the transition. From earner to owner, from addition to multiplication, from time-bound income to asset-based income. That transition changes everything. I borrowed $500 with our home as collateral, received my first dividend of $10 per month, borrowed again for sleeping cars, reinvested everything I received, learned relentlessly from every mentor I could find, followed the railroad infrastructure boom, and invested in every component of it. By 28, my annual income was $42,000, and most of it came from ownership, not wages. By 33, I was wealthy beyond what I'd imagined possible as a bobbin boy. By 65, I sold my steel company for $480 million. But here's what matters to you. I started with $1.20 per week. You have more than that right now. You have access to markets I couldn't have imagined. You have information that I would have paid a fortune to access. You have opportunities to own productive assets that didn't exist in my era. The distance from poverty to wealth isn't magic. It's mathematics. It's the compound effect of right decisions over time. It's understanding the difference between addition and multiplication and organizing your entire financial life around that difference. The first 1,000 teaches you the pattern. You earn more than you spend. You deploy the surplus into assets that generate returns. You reinvest those returns into more assets. You learn faster than you earn, so you can deploy capital more effectively. You follow the infrastructure, so you invest in foundations rather than fads. Then you repeat that pattern. The first 1,000 becomes 10,000. 10,000 becomes 100,000. The numbers change, but the pattern stays the same. Ownership compounds. Reinvestment multiplies. Learning unlocks opportunities. Infrastructure provides stability. I made it from $1.20 per week to hundreds of millions of dollars. The principles that worked in 1855 still work now. The mathematics haven't changed. The compound effect is the same. You're starting from further ahead than I did. You have more tools, more access, more information. The only question is whether you'll follow the pattern, whether you'll cross the threshold from wages to ownership, whether you'll reinvest instead of consume, whether you'll learn instead of coast, whether you'll deploy capital into infrastructure instead of chasing speculation. The path is open. The mechanics are clear. The first 1,000 is waiting for you to understand what it actually is. Not a savings goal, not a number to hit through deprivation and patience. A threshold, a transition. The moment you shift from trading time for money to deploying capital for multiplication. Everything changes after that threshold. Everything compounds after that shift. Now, the only question is whether you'll make the crossing.